Thanks, Nichole. Hey, everybody. My name is Eric Shue with the Snohomish Conservation District. And thanks for coming this afternoon after lunch and all, and just wanting to have you guys learn a little bit more about what there is to offer in terms of cost share and programs from the Commission. And we'll have Jon Culp talk a little bit about that. And also with Nichole Emerson, as she mentioned, as a speaker, talk about what they're doing up in Whatcom County with the program funding up there. So I'll go ahead and introduce Jon. A little bio on Jon is Jon Culp joined the Commission in 2001 and serves as the Water Resource Programs Manager. Previously, Jon worked for the Okanagan Conservation District, where he was a Natural Resource Planner. He also spent 4 years in the U.S. Army as a high-frequency radio direction finder. He has a BA from Central Washington University. Jon has been a council member for the city of Okanagan from 1999 through 2013 and mayor since January of 2014. It's pretty cool. He is a life member of the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation and enjoys the outdoors through camping, hiking, hunting, and also doing some small-scale farming on his property at home. So with that, I want to welcome Jon and hope you guys enjoy the show.
All right, thanks, Eric. And let's see, can you see my screen?
Yep, looks good, Jon.
Okay, because all I can see is myself, so I'm trying, there we go. Okay, so as Eric alluded to, my presentation is on the Irrigation Efficiencies Grant Program. And so I have a question slide at the very end. So if you'd hold your questions to the end, unless you just can't help yourself, and then you can type your question in the questions box and Nichole can let me know, and we can get your question answered. So if you'll just bear with me, we'll get to the question slide at the end. So write your questions down. That might be a great way to go. So what is irrigation efficiencies? I should not have capitalized irrigation and efficiency on the slide because I always think of that as the program itself. And what I'm talking about right here is the concept of efficiency in irrigation practices. And in the little definition I wrote, the quantity diverted relative to the amount used by the crop. So how much water does it take to get the water to the crop? And so that difference is how we measure efficiency when we're talking about irrigation. And so this comes from the Washington Irrigation Guide. It just shows you the difference. So the farther down the list we go, the more efficient a system is, with drip irrigation being 99% efficient. And flood at the top being the least efficient. And you'll see in the title of the slide, it says potential rating. And so that allows for the idea that there are management decisions in irrigation that, so these aren't constants. It's just the top end of each of those systems. And of course, with flood irrigation, and the rill and furrow irrigation, because you're turning water out onto the ground, the soil structure has a lot to do with the efficiency rating there too. And so there's different potentials out there, and that's something that can be measured on farm. So ditch efficiency is a little bit different. I didn't put any percentages out there because it depends. You have water flowing over soil, and so the soil structure underneath the ditch really does impact how much ditch loss you can expect, and then there's also some natural process where a ditch will seal itself through the season and be more efficient at holding the water. And so you'll see the little diagram in the lower left hand side of the screen, and it does have some percentages on there, but take those with a grain of salt. The evaporation is probably fairly correct if there's no shading along the ditch, but the 5 to 40% listed at the bottom of the screen, if you can even see that, it's just a scientific guess. I've seen ditches as with as much as 80% ditch loss, and so it really is, when we do our work measuring ditch loss, it really is on the ground, site specific. We usually do an inflow outflow test where we turn off all the turnouts, measure how much water is going in at the head of the ditch and how much water is reaching the tail end of the ditch to figure out what ditch loss is for that. So where does the water go? So this leans a little more towards the legal end of things, because there's certainly a physical, water evaporates, water percolates. There's a lot of things that water does physically, but the law as it applies to water it's much more of a blunt stick than than fine science, and so they had to draw a line somewhere, and so they break it apart into consumptive use and conveyance loss, and that's how the state treats where the water goes once it's diverted. And so the consumptive use is when it is removed from that specific part of the water cycle and is no longer available to other water users or uses. And so evaporation and transpiration are two ways that I've listed here. And so, of course, evaporation is self-explanatory. Transpiration is the water moving through plants. So as they pull the water up, it's removed from the soil and removed from that part of the water system, or water cycle. So the note at the bottom, deep percolation past the root zone is not considered consumptive by Department of Ecology's interpretation of the water law, and it's fairly clear. Conveyance losses or non-consumptive losses are water that does become available to other users in the basin, and so again, this is the way the law views it. So it physically it actually may not be available, but or it may change from surface water to groundwater, and then so which would be somewhat different part of the water cycle or a different water cycle. So but the way the law treats it, it is available, and it actually is available by law in that surface water source, whether it really is or isn't. And so so examples of that would be ditch loss or lateral flow from a field. So like the tailwater that runs off, well, actually that's down below. If you're applying water faster than it can percolate through the soil, you can get some lateral flow runoff in a field. Deep percolation, water past the root zone, and so the water law treats that as return flow and assumes that it would make it back to the river or stream that it was diverted out of, if that was the case, or groundwater if it was pumped from a well. And then that operational tailwater at the end, if you see the background slide with those furrows in the field, likely at the end there's a collection ditch that's tailing the excess water off that field and delivering it to the next field down the line. And so the Irrigation Efficiencies program is an in-stream flow program, and so we make we harvest the difference when we make a system more efficient. We harvest that saved water for in-stream flow, and how that relates or how that works physically is illustrated in these two little cartoons here. And so, sorry that the text is so small, but to kind of create this in one slide, it's just what had to be done. And so you'll see on the left cartoon, it's real irrigated, and so water's turned out onto the surface of the soil to run from the head of each furrow down to the end of the field, and then there's a return flow. This should have two lines of return flow, one operational tailwater, and the second one is, you'll see that blue triangle off to the right, and that's water that went past the root zone. And so it's subsurface return flow. And so you'll see that dashed green arrow at near the bottom of the cartoon, and that is the return flow to the river. And this river happens to be labeled the Columbia River. So, but then the cartoon to the right is we've converted the same piece of ground to a center pivot. And so you'll notice the circle of green, the field has become a circle. We've fallowed the corners, and there's water down in the root zone. But what we've done is nullify the deep percolation, so we can manage a center pivot to not push water past the root zone. So we don't have subsurface return, and we don't have an operational tail water, because we're only putting on as much water as the crop needs at the time that it needs it. With a center pivot, you're able to manage that closely. So the green dotted line in that return becomes the historic return flow, but there's no longer any flow there. And so in the river, you'll see the water savings within the reach. And so what that is the water that has been saved, both the deep percolation water, the operational tailwater, and the consumptive water that is in the fallowed corners is now in that red bracketed first stretch from the point of diversion down to the historic return flow point. So that's called the primary reach. And then there's brown down below that bracket, that is where the consumptive savings, so that water that used to be taken up by crops in the corners, it actually will flow out. If this is the actual Columbia River, it would flow clear to the Pacific. That's water that has been freed up and is available for other users downstream. So the program itself, like I said, is an in-stream flow program. It kind of got kicked off out of the 2001 drought. So that 2001 legislative session it authorized, and the program itself started actually funding projects in 2002 after a group of stakeholders had put together policies and all the administrative contract templates, etc. So it took a little bit to get it out there, and then got up and running, and we've been going ever since with funding from the legislature. It's all state funded. So the commission, we don't do any project implementation ourselves. Well, we've done one, and that was the Union Gap irrigation district here. Recently, the Rattlesnake Ridge landslide was crushing their main line. It was a canal and pipe, and so the commission funded that directly with that irrigation district. But all of our other projects are implemented with conservation districts around the state, and with the idea that we harvest that saved water, we place it in the state's Trust Water Right program so that the state can manage those in-stream flows. And we also, part of the program, it reduces landowner costs. You don't have to have somebody go out and change hand lines or wheel lines or siphon tubes, etc. It holds your fertilizer in the root zone a lot longer than some of those other more water intensive styles of irrigating. And then we've also seen production increases, but it's possible because, again, there's management decisions that have to go into that. So Then the Department of Ecology, they do all of the water rights work. Once the water is in trust, it's no longer subject to the relinquishment statute. And so again, it's those flows are managed by Ecology in that program, and the trust water retains the original priority date. So a little bit of the history, although I alluded to it before. The appropriation from the legislature actually went to Ecology from 2001 clear up till last year. The legislative session, in a joint agreement between Ecology and the Commission, the legislature did a direct appropriation for program money to the Conservation Commission. We actually haven't gotten to that money yet because we had a few large projects back out of the program last year, and so we had some carry forward money, and we've been operating off that carry forward money. So Ecology is still involved. They still sign every cost share contract and advise us on water rights, valid water rights coming in, and then trust water rights being generated after the fact. And so all of this is made possible by technical assistance grants to the conservation districts that participate for them to develop projects and make an application for cost share, which is then granted by the Conservation Commission and in cooperation with both Ecology and Fish and Wildlife. And so here, so the Commission, we primarily do the implementation and oversight. Ecology has been doing the budget administration. Ecology also does all of the water rights work. Like I said, to put a water right in trust requires a valid water right, and we have to have enough valid water right on that property to ensure that we have a good public benefit in that trust water right, but that we also leave enough for the landowner to continue to farm whatever crops they had been farming before the project. And so conservation districts do all the local implementation with the asterisk of that one project, but the Commission, we're not looking to do that again. And that one the legislature gave to us. We didn't ask for that funding. It was just appropriated to us to implement that project. And so if I had to do it over again, I would have implemented that through a conservation district, because that's what you guys do. So, Fish and Wildlife. So we work with the state's water science team, and they have habitat biologists on staff, and they do a biological benefit assessment when we're developing projects. So they work directly with Ecology, the Commission, and the Conservation District that's developing a project to make sure that the public benefit that we're striving for is increased flow, but it's because of or for the benefit of anadromous salmonids, so, well, anadromous fish. So so we bring in the expert to figure that out. And then we have other partners that are more minor partners and more project specific, or policy, when we do policy generation or try and adaptive management, we bring partners in to help us move forward and keep the program relevant. And so there's a list of those down below. And so WWT is Washington Water Trust for anybody that's not familiar, and TU is Trout Unlimited Washington Water Projects. So those are both nonprofit, non-governmental entities that deal in water in the state. So the benefits that we're looking for, the in-stream flow improvement is down on the list, but really it is the backbone of the program to date. That may change moving forward, and so it's still on the list. It probably should be in bold, but because our customer, we need willing participants, and they care about things other than in-stream flow, and so Improved on-farm water management. I put the production increases up at the top. We had one landowner that, based on his pack outs, showed a 40% increase in production when he looked at his records pre-project and post-project. I don't think that's quite usual. I think it's probably somewhat less than that, but it's one of those things that is site and project specific, depending on the management of the new system moving forward. So, and then so with the conveyance projects, so the ditch to pipe projects, you know, oftentimes those create a pressurized water delivery where one was not available in the ditch without pumping out of the ditch, and so it all depends on how much elevation loss there is through the project area, and it's an on-demand system. So if the ditch is serving, let's say, hay ground primarily, when everybody shuts off their water to let their fields dry out to cut their hay, there is absolutely no water coming out of the river or stream that's being diverted from, unlike a ditch where you have to keep the ditch charged even when nobody's using it. So it really does have flow benefits beyond just reducing those conveyance losses. And then you'll see the others. There's a lot of secondary benefits there, and could be even more project specific depending on the conditions. And so currently, under the current policies, so and I'll talk a little bit about the future of the program in just a little bit, but under the current policies, to be eligible for the efficiencies for an actual cost share project, we have to have agricultural water. So we have not been able to get to city parks and golf courses. Although a lot of times those are fairly efficient, but we've seen some that aren't, and so they also have to be in a priority tributary. And so, and by priority I mean flow limited or over allocated, something where there is a conflict between irrigated agriculture and anadromous fish, especially ESA listed anadromous fish. So that creates a priority for us. Has to be a valid water right, like I said before, and then that benefit at the bottom there. So one of the rules that we have that's been very contentious, if there are people on listening that have been participating in the program, they know what the 5% rule is, but we had to create some hurdles, I guess, to make sure that that we're targeting the right projects. And the 5% rule really leans towards the idea that if you don't save 5% of a large water body, then the fish won't be able to tell the difference in the saved water that you gave because of the daily fluctuation. You know, flows fluctuate daytime to nighttime. And so there's a lot of kind of static when you talk about flows, and so we tried to, in an attempt to prioritize smaller systems where we can get more bang for our buck, we created with Fish and Wildlife this 5% rule. And so it's measured against the lowest mean monthly flow, which is the acronym in the next bullet, and so the 5% rule it applies to those larger systems where that mean monthly flow is greater than 50 CFS. And so if the project's on a small tributary, a creek, then you know, you don't even come close to this. But we also did allow kind of a backdoor to that to say, you know, if you had a line of projects that were all, you know, side by side, and the collective of implementing those projects would create the 5%, that we were going to allow for that, but it would require some commitment prior to the program entering into any agreements there. So here I bring back those cartoons just to illustrate why, because you know, again, this cartoon is about the Columbia River, and so so there's no way that this small center pivot project that is part of the cartoon would qualify because of the 5% rule. The fish would not be able to tell the difference between you know, pre-project and post-project quantity of water in the Columbia River. It's probably a bad example, but I wanted to use an extreme there. And so, you know, if the low mean monthly flow was 130,000 cubic feet per second, I left my post-it somewhere else, but the 5% of that is still, it's north of 6,000 cubic feet per second. And this project, even if it's a large pivot, might save a half a cubic foot per second, or maybe even 1 cubic foot per second, depending on the pre-project efficiency. So so just as an example, we're trying to make increases that actually make a difference. So these are the program totals to date, 69 projects that we've funded across the state. We've spent about $18 million in cost share. That has saved 18,139 acre feet per year. And the flow rate is about 75 cubic feet per second. So see, even our whole program's worth wouldn't make a difference in the Columbia River. So, but and then just for those gallon per minute people, if you're not familiar in cubic foot per second, that's 33,662 gallons per minute. So, and $1,002 per acre foot is below the market rate right now, which down in, I think around the Tri-Cities, I heard somebody say earlier in the week that it was about $3,200 per acre foot down there at present market. So we're well under market value there, which is a good thing. So 24 tributaries across the state in 9 counties. These little, again, there's a lot of overlapping bullet points on this little tiny map here, but I just wanted to show that how the geography across which we've been operating. And so the light colored basins are actually the 16 critical basins, and those ones have been prioritized by the state as either over allocated or flow limited, likely both, that have ESA listed salmonids in them. And so so you'll see that except for the 2 down in Underwood, all the way at the bottom of the map, slightly left of center, there are a couple dots that is not one of the 16 critical basins, but it did meet the other criteria. And so here's an on-farm example, Beaver Creek. This was one of our very first projects, I believe back in 2002 or 2003. Beaver Creek is a pretty small tributary to the Nichole River up in Okanagan County, and 136 acres of alfalfa. So we saved 0.6 of a CFS and 151 acre feet per year. And this project was one of those where, you know, when I was a district technician and planner, you know, when you could find those the king domino project where you push it over and then the neighbors come and you start getting a lot more participation. This project acted like that. We also had that effect in the Tucannon River down in Columbia County. And so this is an example of the domino effect in that basin, where the collective of those projects has put 11 cubic feet per second in the river, and collective of 890 acre feet per year. And so that one was pretty neat, because if you look in the picture, it's a pretty narrow basin, and so you kind of have one landowner after another, and they're all strung together once we did one, it just kind of walked up and down the valley there, and really did enhance flows. And I think that effort brought a lot of attention to the Toucan, which then benefited from a lot of other programs since then. So here's an example of a conveyance project. This is the Touchy River, and this is in the Walla Walla Basin. And so the East Side Irrigation District and the West Side Irrigation District both piped their system at one time. And so it was collective of 6 projects, 9.5 miles of open ditch that we put into pipe. It was a big undertaking. They also took out their diversion dam that was blocking fish passage to the Touchy River just before we did our Efficiencies project with other funding. And so that put in 1,646 acre feet per year and 4.75 cubic feet per second. And so that one was quite a deal. They couldn't have done the piping project without, well, without taking out that dam. So actually, you know, relative to fish and what they felt, it was almost 100% flow restoration there. So the flow increase was actually much greater if you're a fish, from a fish perspective. So that one was a good project. And so the future, that's not me, by the way, but I liked the picture because it looks like everybody's having fun, but but you don't know what's ahead of you. and it could be a little rough going. So, but everybody's got their helmet and safety gear on, so life jackets, but we're still smiling. So the future of the program is a little uncertain because the appropriation comes directly to the commission. We have a lot more flexibility about policy and about the direction of the program moving forward. And so, as you could tell by the presentation right now, the sideboards are pretty high, and the application of the program is fairly limited, both geographically and kind of in what we can fund as a cost share project. And so, but that could change moving forward. And so this pandemic has kind of put the brakes on having policy meetings where we can work to start moving forward on a direction. But I think I'm just going to have to get over that, and we're just going to have to do some virtual scoping of future direction and continue to make this program relevant and work a little more broadly across the landscape than just in stream flows. We do have some ideas. We have done some policy work, and we will be getting to that. And so we have not set a date yet, but I suspect in the next month or so we will try and put together the first of our scoping meetings to move forward. And so hopefully I didn't rush that too much, but I will open it up to questions. My contact information is there at the bottom, so feel free to get in touch with me if you think of a question after today, or if you're just too shy to ask it here, feel free to reach out to me anytime. So.
Yeah, so I'll just remember, folks, before the next presentation segment, if you have questions specific to Jon right now, you can enter them into the question box. You can raise your hand, I'll unmute you, and you can ask it direct, or you can save up or curate those questions until the very end. But if there's anything for Jon right at this point, just be sure to put it in the question box. And or Eric, did you have any leading questions for Jon for this segment of the presentation?
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Nichole. I was curious for, irrigation in general, we tend to kind of focus on projects in Eastern Washington, just kind of by default a little bit, because West Side's typically very rainy and wet, and that's the case this spring at least. But we do run into situations where, we see drought-like conditions and our producers have a significant need for irrigation. And I just I was curious of what you see the trend might be in projects on the west side, given and you have those eligible basins that that you can kind of focus on. Have you seen a trend of increased activity or over the last several years, or how would you quantify that?
I guess there has been some. I mean, it really depends on what funding sources are available out there. When the state's drought response is a little more difficult because it's limited to public projects, and so we can't do these. Almost all of our all of our on-farm projects in efficiencies are with private landowners. Some of our conveyance projects are with irrigation companies, which are privately owned, but also with publicly owned irrigation districts. And so we can work with irrigation districts with drought funding. But what we have done, and some of you have probably participated, is use drought funding for technical assistance through conservation districts. And so and that did increase last year. We had more districts ask to participate in the drought funding than we had in previous droughts. At least I've been around long enough that I helped in the response in 2005, 2015, and then last year. And so each year it seemed like it increased somewhat. But efficiencies wise, no, I don't think, at least our participation has not increased with the increased drought or dry conditions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, thanks, John. Appreciate it.
Okay, we do have a question in the chat box for you, John. It says, is there any potential for the watersheds considered as priorities by the state and thus eligible for this program to be expanded? Any chance watersheds, part of the RCW 9094, the Stream Flow Restoration Act, planning process might be considered?
Yes, I think so. Really, for right now, under the present policies, for us to be able to work in a different basin, let's use the White Salmon River and Buck Creek down in Underwood as an example. The conditions that exist in the priority basins exist down there in the White Salmon River and Buck Creek, and so maybe it would have been the 8th east or the 9th east side priority basin. I don't know if it missed the cutoff, but I guess my point is that certainly there are basins that are over allocated that have a conflict between fish flow and irrigated agriculture that we might be able to do something about with project funds. Currently, we need to negotiate that with Department of Ecology because they still are the keeper of the purse strings on the money that we're presently using. Once we shift over to commission funds, which hopefully will be shortly, we've got a couple big projects in the pipeline right now. Once that happens, then it'll be a lot easier. We'll just have to negotiate with ourselves about whether or not that those are wise investments. Because certainly a lot of the priority districts we don't have fixed yet, and so and not to say that our program is going to be the solution, but sometimes it gets hard to move to a new place when the old places are still not operating at peak efficiency. So yeah, I think there's a possibility moving forward, especially as we move through this adaptive management piece, to start spending commission money.
One more question in the chat box. With the 5% rule in mind, do you have any recommendations for farms near large rivers like the Snake or Columbia River?
I would say if you're looking at the Irrigation Efficiencies program to fund projects, it would require some groundwork to go out and find a collective you know, the Snake River is smaller. It would certainly be easier than the Columbia River. I don't know that we could ever, under the present system, fund projects on the Columbia River. I just don't know that we could make a difference. I don't know that there's that much water being applied. And so, yeah, you know, it would involve putting together a large landscape of projects to create that type of savings. While it's an in-stream flow program, if it becomes something else moving forward through policy change and you know, the commission passing new policies where they focus on something else like water quality or I don't even want to speculate what else it might be, but where the public benefit was something other than in-stream flow, then I would say maybe there's a possibility there.
Okay. John, should we turn it over to the second half?
Absolutely.
And we can, okay. And Eric, let's turn it over to the second half and we'll come back to questions at the end.
Great. Thank you, John. Really appreciate your time there. Well, everybody, we're on to our next phase of this presentation, and I'm happy to introduce Dr. Nichole Embertson, who is also our mediator, is a nutrient management and air quality specialist and the science and planning coordinator at the Whatcom Conservation District. She also serves as an adjunct professor at Washington State University and director of the Washington Discovery Farms program. She provides technical assistance through research and education on nutrient and environmental issues to livestock and dairy producers, agencies, and industry across Washington State and the U.S. So welcome, Nichole, and thank you for talking to us about irrigation program in Whatcom and how you're utilizing these funds.
You bet. And can you see my video and my screen okay?
Yes, thank you.
Great. I'm on the other side of this now. All right. Hey, everybody. Great to see you all. So I'm going to talk a little bit differently. So the Whatcom Conservation District, I'm up in that northwest corner of the state, one of those priority areas. And we have a little bit different program that we've used the funding for and why we've gone in that direction based on our geographical area as well as the folks that we work with. So we've both utilized the irrigation efficiency funds and we utilize drought funds to really get a head start on things. So where we're at, one of our primary irrigation water users is dairy, which would be corn and grass. We also have a large component of our acres, or it's growing all the time, into blueberry, raspberry, and potatoes. And the difference there is that these more specialty crops definitely utilize drip irrigation, and they're, for the most part, some are using overhead, but they're really monitoring their water. So they are looking at what is their irrigation rates and trying to modify that. But the majority use of all our acres is dairy. Most of that is done with overhead irrigation or no irrigation. But in the case of overhead irrigation, there's not a lot of technical thought put towards it. It's more about pulling that reel across the field in however long that takes, and then getting all the other fields done and coming back. The point being, our water use isn't necessarily efficient for a huge portion of our acreage. So for us, it wasn't necessarily installing a singular practice with a single landowner, but trying to get a broader outreach and information highway to our landowners so that we could make a bigger difference. So for us, it was important that we were able to really work with individuals on, how do we move forward, starting with developing an inventory of what was going on with irrigation in our area, developing partnerships with those players who not only were working with technical areas of irrigation, and that can be from Washington State University to irrigation supply companies, all the way over to the landowners or irrigation water improvement districts, and other partners in the county who have part of this. So it was really important to develop that right off the bat and then to start to develop data. So me as a scientist, I'm obviously biased that we always need good data. We always need more numbers, more information so that we can make better decisions. So trying to develop and install a weather and soil moisture monitoring network was imperative. And I'm going to talk a bit about that today, as well as the education and outreach part, providing the information that people need. Number one, to know perhaps maybe what they could be doing better, how to access the information to do so, and then what are the resources available to them to make those modifications to move forward so that we could, on a big level, affect many people all at once. And of course, that technical assistance part of this, so really getting down to the field level with individual landowners and doing those irrigation water management plans so that they had a way to move forward on doing things differently and hopefully doing them better to save water or use their water more effectively and efficiently for better water use and crop outcomes. And lastly, using this momentum that we had this original funding for to leverage additional grants and projects. So the first part of this I want to talk about was really important to us in putting out more monitoring so that people even knew, what is this, water numbers, how do we develop this, where does this go, etc. And so the Whatcom Conservation District worked with WSU's Ag WeatherNet folks to develop what are called these tier 2 sites. So I'll show you it here in a second, but Ag WeatherNet is a broad-based weather network throughout the state that WSU installs and keeps up. And to date, they've only had these very expensive, high class, if you will, systems. Only about a year ago, there's a new director to this program, Dave Brown, who instituted they would now accept these tier 2 sites if you used approved equipment. And so we were able to use this funding to purchase these tier 2 site equipment, which I've got listed up here, and get more of these stations installed. The biggest thing we were able to do was install soil water monitoring loggers, which then allowed us to get background values for water in different soil types around our county, so that even if someone can't afford to put in their own irrigation equipment, at least they're going to have an idea of when they need to get started and when they need to stop. So in Whatcom County in Western Washington, as you guys know, we are wet forever, it feels, especially this year. And then we're extremely dry. In fact, Western Washington is one of the driest areas in the country in the summer months, unlike other areas that get the monsoon season. So we can be in drought for a few months, and if that extends September, October, or longer, it can be a real problem. But it also comes up fast on certain soil types, and most of our folks are already behind on irrigation by the time they start, and they had no idea. So being able to get these stations out there and get more data has been really important for us to connect with our local landowners. So here I list that equipment that WSU recommended was from Meter Group, this Atmos 41 weather station with a data logger and transmitter. You can kind of see that in the background here, the station. And the soil water potential probes, we have them at 2 depths that I'll show you. And about total cost, you're just under $3K or so. One thing about these stations, and I know other districts have either partnered with WSU and or put these in themselves, we purchased, instead of contracting with WSU so they could purchase and install, we ended up purchasing and then having to work with them on installation, and it wasn't a smooth process. In other words, when WSU can purchase and install, they can save a lot of money, it turns out. They will also keep your stations up and running for you when you integrate into this Ag WeatherNet network, as well as that data is now on a public accessible forum. And I'll show you what that looks like for data and how individual producers can access it. We also have these systems you can buy and install yourself for your own personal work. So not only do we have these broad network stations, we're also installing these on individual landowner sites so they can see exactly what their activity is doing. And it just gives a lot more in-depth information about how their actions and activities are affecting their field in irrigation. And I'll come back to that in a second. So this is what that WSU Ag WeatherNet looks like for Whatcom County. You can see that there's stations that have a black outline and a white outline. The white outline are these new tier 2 sites. The black outline are those original tier 1 sites that they installed. And when you click on any one of them, you get what that station is transmitting data-wise. You can actually see this is that full setup on the landowner's property that we had installed. And the cool things here, it's this 2-inch soil temperature and this 2-inch soil water potential measures that we're really starting to use. And you can see it's provided in this KPA value. And if you don't know what that is, you have no idea what that is. So this is also, you'll see in our next slide when we talk about how to interpret this information, we are actually also working with WSU right now on how to better develop and interpret that information for landowners. So I just want to quickly show what this whole network looks like for folks. So hopefully you can see that. So you can see in Washington State as a whole, there are a lot of these Ag WeatherNet sites all over the place. This is up here in my Whatcom County area, but you can also see there are these tier 2 sites over in the Okanagan area, and we've got some central, and they're starting to pop up south. I highly recommend if you've got the funds to connect with them and put these in so that all of your farmers and landowners can access that and start to get an idea once again about what are those values, where are we at with soil water potential. We list the soil type here, what's that sand, silt percent, and clay percentages, so that can be compared to an individual landowner soil type. And you can get a lot of data from this as well when you go into weather data. If you click on that, click on your site. This might take a few minutes to pull up. You will click on any one of those sites, and you're going to get a lot of that data, including that soil temperature and that soil water potential. So you can see how it changes over time, and it's amazing how much it'll ramp up when it's time to start irrigating. It's actually pretty incredible. So if we go back, I want to show what we did. So we've got that Ag WeatherNet site information, extremely helpful for landowners. We're starting to communicate that out, and we're mostly doing our outreach material through our webpage. So you've got those values that I showed you, and they're like, great, now how do I use that? And until we get an easy metric, we tried to put some interpretation values on our website for folks and how to use that. We also use this to develop handouts. So a quick little postcard size thing for an individual to say, you know, when do you start irrigating, how much, and what's that efficiency, getting that out. And lastly, we just created a video with our livestock and research team in-house on irrigation. And so they're in the final stages of doing that. This, unfortunately, this year had to take place of a real outdoor irrigation event we wanted to have. But again, this is an everlasting resource we have now that we can share. So not the worst thing ever that we've got. Lastly, this irrigation water management planning. So, you know, not only installing that equipment for folks and using this funding to do that, but then we've got all these additional support tools. Our next speaker might be talking about the irrigation scheduler tool, which is a way to take all that data, put it in something that will make real-time decisions with you for your field at any time. Followed by irrigation calibration. Amazing how many people do not do this. So even if they think they're doing an okay job with irrigation, they could be wickedly under or over irrigating. So that was a big part to talk about, people. And then all of this culminates into the development of an irrigation water management plan. So that is that endpoint TA with, once we've got all this information, providing that to a landowner so that they can move forward with making good decisions on their land. They can adapt that as needed so that their water use is, we can track that a lot better. We have more quantitative values to look at that 5% factor or other ways to measure that. And then we were able to really take that original drought funding to this irrigation efficiency funding that was talked about. Our county provided us funding for developing a larger water use efficiencies program, and we recently received a grant from NRCS, one of their conservation innovation grants, to look at sub-irrigation versus surface irrigation. So we've really just been able to build over time with all these different grant sources and all this work to get to a place where we can start to do these projects and really show how they work. So we've been very lucky in being able to build this with the different funding sources available, and the commission's funding was our original way to get that going, which has been really, really valuable for us. So with that, I can also take questions if you guys have them. I will dual hat here. Put your questions in the chat box if you have any. Our speakers will be happy to address those, as well as John. We can have you come back online, and the both of us can answer any questions that you guys have for this, either chat box or raise a hand. And John, yeah, if you're there, or Eric, if you've got any leading questions that you want to start us off on. John, it looks like you might be muted.
I think, how many sites, tier 2 sites do you have going right now, Nichole?
We have 4 installed and we've got 2 more planned. It's I will say, well, they're awesome. They are a little, you really have to meet all the requirements with sight lines and things around it. Obviously you want a safe location, but it was pretty easy to work with the folks at AgWeatherNet. They were really helpful in helping us figure out where and how to do that.
Okay.
And I do see a question in regards to the data there. It says, can the data from the tier 2 stations be plugged into the irrigation scheduler? I think so, Adam, but I'm going to have you ask that question to our next speaker, who will be able to answer that perfectly. Unless, John, if you've used that tool and know that, I think so. I want to say I'm pretty sure, but I'm not positive.
I have used the scheduler, but I don't know about whether or not it's compatible with the tier 2 data.
Okay. Yeah, Adam, I'm gonna ask that question again with our next speaker, who I bet can answer it for us. Okay. In our last minute here, did you have anything you wanted to add, John or Eric? Any final questions that you have?
I'll default to Eric if he has any more questions.
Yeah, you know, I just really appreciate you guys being up here and talking today. And it's kind of pretty self-serving for me, because I really want to develop a program in Snohomish and how to better serve our producers and so forth. And that's actually, at that time, you know, trying to figure out exactly where to add some sites. It sounds like WSU helped you with that. But I know we've had interest from landowners up in Granite Falls and Oso, which is really out of, you know, the traditional agricultural area for us in a sense. So anyway, so yeah, that's just trying to figure out some of those logistics.
Yeah, and I'm more than happy to chat with any district at any time. My contact information is up, and you can give me a call or an email, and I can talk about how we did our funding in our program. I know obviously John is the same, very, very helpful.
Yeah. So, and I will just mention real briefly that there was a drought bill that passed the legislature here this last session that actually created a program for drought resiliency. And so Ecology chose not to ask for funding for it because of this COVID impact on our state budget, the sensitivity to that. And so, but hopefully maybe next biennium, they will seek to fund that, and it would fund projects that create drought resiliency. And so I think it's going to open up some possibilities for not just east side projects, but also west side projects as well. And so hopefully we will be invited to the table as they do rulemaking and policy making for, you know, the types of projects that they want to fund. And so I'm looking forward to possibly having another tool for your guys' toolkit there.
That's great.
Great.